So we're going to go into the inconsistencies, gaps, and unexplored pathways. Now, as I go through this section, remember, everything's going to keep leading on, okay? But I want to ask you this question here as I go through this. I want you to think of this question. Is it animal sold or is it donated? Now, back in 2016, 2017, Joe did sell some animals and also donate animals. And what he did is he created what I refer to as a transportation team. Okay, this transportation team went to multiple states, Missouri, Texas, California, and many others, to either transport and sell these animals or donate these animals, or sometimes a combination thereof. This transportation team consisted of 3 people that I'm going to specifically talk about because one of them was one of the key witnesses for the U.S. Attorney's Office in prosecuting Joe. These 3 people, one is Marcia David, and that's the trial transcripts we'll go over. Her husband, Johnny David, and a name that a lot of you will be familiar with, which is John Finley, which happens to be Joe Exotic's ex-husband. So essentially they would load these vehicles up, or these animals up in the vehicle, and they would transport. Now I know that he has 8 counts, and I don't have time to go through all 8 of them because we're on a shortened time frame here, but what I am going to do is point out a little bit of inconsistency since Marcia was one of the lead witnesses against Joe. So as I get into this here, she was asked on the stand, do you remember what kind of animals you transported? And Marcia mentions, you mean the ones to Missouri, right? Because remember, I mentioned to you there's multiple states. And she says there were quite a few. There was an alligator, a lion, a baby lion, a bunch of birds, some bats, and some serval cats. It's quite a bit of animals, right? Now, anytime you go ahead and you're doing this transportation, and like I mentioned before, you have a lot of paperwork. On this paperwork, Joe had the lion and the baby lion listed as a donation. And this is important to know because it is illegal to sell an endangered species. Okay? But the other animals, the birds, the bats, the serval cats, those were all legal to sell. So as they get up to Missouri and they drop off these animals, the 3 individuals on the transport team receive $5,000. That was the payment. They go back to the GW Zoo in Oklahoma. They give Joe that money. Joe pays them for their expenses, their gas, and they go about their business. But here's where it gets a little interesting. Where it gets interesting is the very next question, because this is coming in cross-examination. Now, the U.S. attorney, when they went ahead and did these charges on Joe, it was saying that the information for the donation of the lion and the baby lion were sold illegally, even though he had it listed on the paperwork as donation. And that's coming because Marcia David states that when they sold these, it was all sold all in one package. But here, look at this question here. You were a part of, or do you have an understanding of how that $5,000 relates to which animals went to Missouri? And her answer was no. Shocked the defense attorney. The defense attorney said, no? You really don't know? No, I don't. Okay? So think about that for a minute. She's a part of the transportation team, has no idea what's on the paperwork, has no idea what's donated, has no idea what's sold. So I ask you that question again. Was this animals being sold, or was this donated? Well, we're going to move on because I want to cover another topic here, and we're going to keep going. Like I said, this is going to keep ramping up as we go here. Who remembers about the 5 tigers, right? You had the 5 tigers in question. That's what the prosecution team led off with to get their first, bit of information on Joe or conviction on Joe. So I want to set the stage for you here on this, okay? Because this is also important. The U.S. attorney claimed that these 5 tigers were killed for no reason. The tigers were healthy. There was no problems at all. They were killed just to make room for other animals to come into the zoo. Okay? Agent Markley with Fish and Wildlife Services was the lead agent in charge of exhuming these tigers and the tiger carcasses. So he shows up at the GW Zoo. Jeff Lowe gives him his consent to search because Jeff Lowe owned the zoo at the time. He goes onto the property. They already have little stakes out for where they believe these tigers are buried. He brings all the equipment with him. He brings heavy machinery, reciprocating tools, right? Saws, knives, things such as that. They start their dig. They locate where the tigers are. So as they carefully remove all the dirt and they dig up the area, there's 5 tiger carcasses in a row. Agent Markley then goes into that pit and he starts looking at these tigers. And he goes ahead and he takes out the knife and he takes out the saw and he actually starts removing the heads of these tigers right from the vertebrae. And then what he does systematically, he labels them. Tiger skull 1, tiger skull 2, tiger skull 3, right? And he's sending that off after they're marked because that's important chain of custody, right? The chain of evidence custody. That's because these tiger heads are now going to go all the way out to the west coast of Oregon to a forensics lab where you have a forensics pathologist that's going to do an entire evaluation on these tiger skulls. So as we look here, Agent Markley's going to talk about that he removed these 5 tiger skulls, right? They separated the heads from the carcass with a reciprocating tool, using a saw and a knife to separate them from the vertebrae, okay? That's what we just talked about. Then the question was asked, is there any reason you did not remove the entire tiger carcass? And he states, we were specifically looking for gunshot wounds to the head. We didn't have a reason to remove the entire carcass from the ground. Which brings me to this point. Joe had a vet that worked at the zoo named Dr. Green. Dr. Green knew the history of these animals. Joe knew the history of these animals. They had been making a report where it is known in the medical history of these animals that they had arthritis, they had degenerative issues, and other ailments, okay? So they were only concerned about the gunshot wound to the head as the manner of death because that's what the U.S. Attorney says they were just randomly killed to make room. Could anybody in here, I just need one volunteer to tell me what is the purpose of an autopsy? The first, that's right, to determine the cause of death. You do the autopsies because you always want to have a full 360 analysis of why that death happened. So when you do that, whether you're doing an autopsy for an animal or you're doing an autopsy for a human, it is critically important to know everything and why that death happened, right? Things come into play like previous medical history, previous medication history, lifestyle, the obvious things, gunshot, stab wounds. Did the person die of a pulmonary embolism? Was it natural causes? Was it a heart attack? The list can go on and on for causes of death, but you do the full 360 analysis because that information is critical to any investigation. But in this particular case, they're only concerned with the heads. And we already know that they were killed with a gunshot wound, which is what they wanted to prove, right? So let's take it a step further. Cross-examination, he's asked, your investigation was tunneled at this point to just the heads of these animals, is that correct? And he said, yes, we were just interested basically in removing the heads. That's what we were there for. So you were not interested in the bodies, correct? He says, we did not remove the bodies. So to this day, these bodies have never been analyzed by the Fish and Wildlife Services. He doesn't know of it. In fact, Agent Markley even goes on as far as to say, after they removed the tiger skulls, they just covered the carcasses back up with dirt, and they went about their business. They went on with their investigation. So this brings us to what happened in Oregon. You have a forensics pathologist by the name of Dr. Tabitha Viner, clearly a professional in her field, great at what she does. She receives these 5 tiger skulls. And her whole entire job, now she has to do a partial autopsy, is to start noting anything that is wrong, right? She's looking for the cause of death, which would be the gunshot wound. But she's also making any notes of anything that she sees that would be wrong with the tiger skulls. And remember, the U.S. Attorney claimed that these tigers were only killed to make room. However, Dr. Tabitha Viner starts looking at these skulls as they come in, Tiger 1, Tiger 2, and so on. One of the things she notices is that one of the tigers had the root on their tooth was completely exposed. Now, I don't know about you guys, I've had a toothache before and it sucks. And I'm sure if you've had a toothache, it sucks too, right? Can you imagine having the root being completely exposed? Another one of the tigers had an infection in the mouth that they could tell based on, the teeth and the wear and the, gum lines and so on. An infection. Then you have another tiger that had a fracture that went from the right canine tooth across the top of the mouth to the left canine tooth. How that happened, I don't know, but she notes it in her report. So she's asked during direct testimony, in addition to determining the cause of death, did you conduct any analysis of the teeth or any parts of the skull looking for tooth wear or other abnormalities? And she says, yes, I noted during the examination any kind of abnormalities to the teeth, which is some of what I just told you about, right? So she's on the stand and she's given this photo that she took in her lab back when she did her examination, and it specifically states in there what I just told you. There was a fracture from the right canine tooth over the top of the mouth to the left canine tooth, and it was asymmetrical. So let's take this a little bit further. Much like we have the American Medical Association for us, right, which is kind of like the standard guidelines for medical care. Well, they have the same thing with vets, and it's called the American Veterinary Medical Association, the MVMA. And that is the guideline that everybody's to follow, right? It's a standard. Where she was asked on the stand if a gunshot wound is an approved method of euthanasia. And she says, yes, it is. And asked why. Why is it an approved method? Because it is quick if it is done properly. Now I want to note to everybody here, Dr. Green was familiar with the history of these animals. And again, Joe was familiar with the history of these animals. Dr. Green gave written permission to Joe to euthanize these animals in the event that the event cannot be present. And Dr. Green wasn't present at the time this happened because of the history of these animals, that permission was actually given. Euthanasia, gunshot for euthanasia is an approved method. Okay? So now Dr. Green goes on to state in here a little bit further. This has come in during the cross-examination. If you were provided the bodies of these animals, would you have been able to determine whether or not there was any issues, for example, like with their paws? And she says, because these animals were so decomposed, soft tissue may not have been present, but would it help to determine if the animal had, for example, clone disease? But if there was arthritis, it would have shown up in the bones. Now, what was the animal's medical history with the vets? Arthritis is reported, right? Then he goes on to ask the next question. With respect to evaluating the animal's spine, were there any type of degenerative issues? Could you have been able to determine that as well? Dr. Viner says yes. And is there any reason why your lab wouldn't have been able to do a full examination of these tiger carcasses? And she says, no, they could have done the full examinations had they have been asked to do so. Now, me as an investigator, when I work a case, my goal is to paint a picture so perfectly clear that my prosecutors have no problem prosecuting this case. And I do that because as I'm working my case, I'm making sure that there isn't anything a defense attorney can ask me that's going to stump me on the stand or cause my investigation to come into question. Which is why I bring up the part, you have a partial autopsy or you do the full autopsy. Medical history. These animals had documented medical history, but that was never examined. So we covered Lacey Act, we covered endangered species. Let's get into what got Joe an awful lot of time, right? Which is the murder for hire. So we know he has 2 counts of murder for hire. So the question I'll ask you as I go into this, is it intent or is it free speech? So, late 2017, Agent Williams with the FBI, he's the undercover agent, shows up at the GW Zoo. He didn't show up unannounced. He wasn't invited by Joe. In fact, Agent Williams was brought in on this by James Garretson, another one of the characters within the show, right? James Garretson spent 2.5 months trying to get this meeting arranged to show up at the zoo with Agent Williams. The day comes, they get to the zoo, they find Joe, and they proceed to Joe's office where they have a conversation. Now we know through the trial transcripts, 47 minutes was all that the audio recording was. 47 minutes. The first almost 15 minutes of that conversation was them just shooting the breeze and having conversation and talking a bunch of trash. Until James Garretson starts nudging Joe like, hey, this is the guy. You know the guy? You know what I'm talking about? And so now Joe is like, all right, so what does something like this cost me? Like, what, $10,000? And so the undercover FBI agent says, well, it cost me $5,000 if you want me to do it, and I need the money up front. So as an investigator, right, if I'm in this situation, the agent did what he's supposed to try to do, which now you want to show the intent. I need you to commit to the next steps to show just how serious you really are for this murder for hire to go down, okay? So what does this agent do? He goes ahead and he asks Joe, I need you to go to Walmart and I want you to get 2 burner phones. And the reason for that is that nobody else in the world will know that they're communicating on these 2 burner phones. That is strictly Joe and the undercover agent. Nobody would have a clue they're ever communicating. After the murder for hire is done, you could smash the phones, burn the phones, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want with the phones. They disappear and nobody has a record they ever existed. So that's the intent that he tried to get Joe to do. But Joe's response is, well, why don't you go to Walmart and get the phones? Typical Joe, right? So Joe doesn't take the bait on that one. So now the agent comes back to the conversation a few minutes later and he says, why don't you give me a pistol and I'll go down there and take care of this for you? And Joe looks at him and was like, well, then the pistol's going to come back to Oklahoma. Why would I want to do that? Right? So that was the second attempt to try to get Joe to show his intent. But there's a third attempt. The third attempt is, Joe, I need you to get me some maps and some overlays of Carol Baskin, where she lives, everything, right? Joe doesn't provide it. In fact, it's not till much later, James Garretson actually provides it to the undercover FBI agent. I'm going to show you a little bit of the testimony, and I'm going to dive a little bit more into this. This is Agent Williams doing his testimony, and it says, you testified in a statement about getting 2 burner phones. Remember I talked about that, right? 2 burner phones. He says, yes, sir. What was the purpose of suggesting that to Mr. Passage? To convincingly portray myself as somebody who has knowledge of operational security. Remember, only those 2 know about it, right? Loose lips sink ships. That would facilitate a successful murder for hire. That's what he wanted to portray himself to be to Joe. Then he's asked, well, isn't another reason why you want him to do that, as you're suggesting a concrete step, which, if he had taken, would have shown he truly had the intent, there's that big word again, to solicit you to commit a murder of Carol Baskin. And he says, I would agree with you. That would be a concrete step. And you're suggesting an additional concrete step, which, if he had taken, would further your investigation. And he says, if it had, taken that additional step, you're right. Right? That would be a concrete step. And so the next question. These were, in the additional steps, they were suggested during that meeting, provide the money, correct? He says those were things that were brought up as things that would need or could happen prior to committing the act, like getting the 2 phones, right? Getting a pistol, having a map sent. None of those were done, correct? Or at least to the best of your knowledge. And Agent Williams says, to my knowledge, no, sir. None of those steps happened. He didn't get the burner phones. He didn't provide money. He didn't go ahead and start creating a slush fund to pay for the $5,000 by selling tigers and cubs and other animals. I want to note it here, Joe never reached out to this agent again, never. He never made an attempt, he never went through James Garrettson. In fact, he never talked to James Garrettson really again after this. He didn't provide anything. It's as if the conversation never happened. So I ask you, is it intent or is it free speech? Brings us to the second part of the murder for hire. Good old Alan Glover. What a character he is, right? So the question is, did Alan go to Florida? So I'm going to paint this picture for you. November 21st, 2017, that's when the murder for hire was technically contracted with Alan, according to the government's case. $3,000 cash was given to Alan by Joe Exotic. Now, we're going to come back to that $3,000 next because that is a huge piece that I'm going to point out to you. That $3,000 allegedly goes from Joe to Alan. Alan goes to South Carolina, then off to Florida, back to South Carolina, and then eventually he's to make his way to the zoo. He's on the witness stand at this point, and he's questioned about June 21st of 2018. The reason for this is because Alan was recorded by Jeff Lowe. And the recording was intercepted somehow. What I know is that it ended up in the evidence chain for the trial, so the defense attorneys got to hear it, the prosecutor's office got to hear it. Alan doesn't know this yet, so he's on the witness stand. And on that audio recording, he was caught saying to Jeff, I will tell them I went down there if you want me to. It's kind of a pretty big statement, right? So here he is on the stand, and he's asked, isn't it true that you did not go to Florida? And Alan's like, yeah, I went to Florida. I just don't know if I made it to the Tampa area. All right. Isn't it true that you had conversations with Mr. Lowe whether or not you should tell the authorities you went to Florida? He says, yeah, he told me to tell the truth. That's why I came back. Okay. So he goes on, do you remember talking to him on June 21st of 2018? He says, no, I don't. And I can't really blame him. I don't know the dates of when I talk to people either. So the attorney gives him a landmark. And on this landmark, he said, all right, let me give you a landmark, Joe, or Alan. That would be about 2 weeks before you came back to the park. Do you remember that? And Alan agrees. Do you recall telling him in the context of what's going on, I can say I went down there then? Do you remember telling Mr. Lowe that? He says, no, I don't. So if that's on a recording and it shows you saying that, how would you explain it? I would say I went down there then. I went down there for a day. No, Alan. How would you explain telling Mr. Lowe that you'll say you'll go, I went down there if you want me to? And Alan's response, no, I never said nothing like that. Well then, Alan, what did you say? What you just said. But it wasn't like that. All right. Well, that makes a whole lot of sense, right? Let's go ahead and note this. There hasn't been a single bit of evidence whatsoever that Alan ever went to Florida. He had 3 phones. Not one of those phones pinged in any tower in the state of Florida. There wasn't one receipt for gas, receipt for food, any video surveillance, no hotel stays, absolutely zero.